Here we are. This is a miniature plum. Not ready yet, but it'll be alright. I've left this one out for the birds, the rest are covered. Now, I want to talk about or discuss how capitalism co-opts social, cultural and political movements. Because capitalism, as you know, is an economic system based on private investment for private profit. And I think historically we need to look at the background. And it's quite interesting to see that when the colonisation of Australia began, the difference between the public and the private sector. When the first fleet came to Australia to establish a colony at Port Jackson in 1788, it was paid for by the British government. And although there were some deaths on the voyage, most of the convicts and soldiers and administrators arrived at Port Jackson in a relatively good condition, with enough provisions to begin agriculture at Port Jackson. Obviously, I'm not going to speak about the profound impact it had on the local population. I remember there was one entry in one journal 3 or 4 years after the colonisation process had began that spoke about bodies lying all over the beaches at Port Jackson from the introduction of smallpox, which had a profound impact on the local population. But let's look at the colonisation aspect. So the first fleet came across relatively disease-free. The second fleet, the government entered into a private-public partnership. It called for tenders for people to, local capitalists, to provide capital, obviously for a profit, to bring across the second load of convicts and administrators and soldiers. That voyage was a total disaster. Disease was rife. Many people died. Over 20%, possibly 30% of the convicts and soldiers died. And the problem was that the private investors, attempting to make a profit, cut back on many of the provisions and services that were required to ensure that people got across to Port Jackson from England. That's just a simple example. At the same time, we've had many examples of private-public partnerships in this country, and a prime example is what's happening to what's left of the public housing sector in Victoria, where the government has gone into a private-public partnership with the private sector, gives away publicly owned land, which has been owned for generations, to the private sector to build private public housing, 90% private housing, 10% public housing, and usually the public housing is substandard in the worst position on that particular block of land. And we see it over and over again. We've seen the privatisation of Qantas, the privatisation of telecommunications, Telecom, the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, even the privatisation of Medibank Private. There's even discussion, there's partial privatisation of the so-called public health system, there's partial privatisation of Centrelink. We saw the privatisation of the Unemployment Bureau, which was part of the Commonwealth Government services to unemployed people. Now it's being privatised. We've seen the privatisation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the privatisation of many aspects of everyday life. We saw the privatisation of electricity, gas, especially in Victoria, and much more public infrastructure. Even in public hospitals, we see the privatisation of ward staff, who are basically contract workers from a private corporation, privatisation of kitchens. We saw the disastrous consequences of the privatisation of the aged care system, because obviously If you're in business, you need to make a profit. If you don't make a profit in a capitalist economy, you die. It's that simple. So in order to make a profit, you make a profit in two ways. You squeeze your customers or your consumers, or you squeeze your workers. Now in this country we've had legislation which has been passed over the last 30 years which has basically made striking illegal. We've passed legislation which has whittled away what little power the trade unions were able to exercise. We've passed legislation and set up judicial bodies like the Fair Work Commission, whose major function in life is to keep downward pressure on wages. We've opened the border to semi-skilled and unskilled guest workers on temporary visas in order to put downward pressure on wages and to ensure that we create an economic model which is based on the exploitation of overseas workers. The current cry for staff in the agricultural sector, the hospitality sector and many other sectors highlights the inadequacy of having a private sector dominate every aspect of our existence. But I'm interested to look at something further, something more insidious, something more dangerous, something which has a profound impact on activity and activism. And I think the profound number one example is the climate emergency. Now the climate emergency in this country is seen as a mechanism by which to make money. There are many ways to tackle the climate emergency. You can tackle the climate emergency in different ways. But what we are doing is we are using the very model which caused the climate emergency to continue, that's the Great Australian Salute, to continue, here we go again, to continue capitalist modes of production. We're not talking about changing the economy from one based on the fulfillment of desire to fulfillment of need. I mean, capitalism is a very simple, dynamic concept, and it needs ever-increasing markets, more consumers, more consumer participation in order to survive, prosper and grow. And we saw this with the internet, the World Wide Web, which initially was designed to provide people a mechanism via which to communicate in times of crisis and to, say, during a nuclear war. It was supposed to democratise discussion. It was supposed to allow ordinary people to be able to break down the bonds that the legacy media had, the fact that it continued to set the agenda. In 2021, it's the same problem. The legacy media continues to set the agenda, but the internet now has become not just a vortex of misinformation and disinformation and something which spews hatred, but more importantly, it's become a mechanism via which people make money. And they make money by using your data, your personal information. I mean, all the Googles, the Twitters, the Facebooks, they're all based on advertising, private advertising. And the more eyes on your particular site, the greater advertising pull. It's got to such a stage that if you have enough eyes on your site, you actually get paid by Facebook and other mediums. So we saw a technology which was supposed to democratise society, which was supposed to lead to a more caring, egalitarian community, which was allowed people to bypass the institutional structures which ensure that we continue to have a growing inequality in the society, become the very instrument which oppresses people, the very instrument which spreads disinformation, the very instrument that causes division, the very instrument which generates fortunes for owners and stock owners, share owners, and the list goes on and on. Then we've got even a more insidious. Now, there are many social movements in a capitalist society. Many social movements. The movement for marriage equality, the movement for rights, gay rights, the movement for women's rights, and I said before, the movement for climate change. They're all seen as movements which can be co-opted and used to generate profits. We have concepts like the pink dollar. We have concepts like we can go ahead with technology and continue to create greenhouse emissions, but supposedly with technology we'll be able to control it and make a buck at the same time. So it's all about the profit motive. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with the health of the community, the health of individuals, the health of families, the health of sovereign nation states, and the health of the globe. Nothing at all to do with that. It's about generating profit. But there is one movement they cannot co-opt. You can co-opt social movements. You can integrate them into the capitalist framework. You can divide people on the basis of, you can actually use the divisions that exist in society between different groups in order to enrich yourself. But there is one movement they cannot co-opt, which they are very frightened about, and that's the movement to equality. That is the movement which talks about making profound changes to the capitalist system, initially by introducing a third economic tier, and I'm talking about the cooperative and collective economy. Also reintroducing public institutions, reintroducing publicly owned institutions whose ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, so they cannot be sold at a later date by a government which thinks it needs, it has an ideological agenda to give everything over to the private sector. We can re-expand the public sector, but this time we don't make the same mistake. We don't leave it in the hands of the government of the day. There is one agenda they can't co-opt, and as I said before, that's the agenda for a share in the economy. That's the agenda to ensure profits are redistributed to each and every one of us. It's extraordinary that we see an organisation which, like the Smith family, which I have a lot of, I feel a lot of, I've got nothing against the Smith family, but advertising to get Australians to sponsor Australian children, the 1.2 million children living in poverty in a population of 25 million. It's just quite extraordinary to see them advertising, looking for sponsors for Australian children. This is a rich country. We shouldn't have to rely on private charities so that children get the basic necessities of life. This is a rich country. We shouldn't have billionaires while 35% of the population relies on social security benefits to survive, because these billionaires are able to exploit public resources in the ground, mineral resources. These billionaires are able to invest in providing public necessary infrastructure. It shouldn't occur. If you look at early childhood development centres, aged care centres at the other end of the lifespan, and if you look at many of these centres, the NDIS, they're all based on the concept of letting the private sector have its head. And what happens when you have unbridled competition? Prices increase, inequality increase, and it's no wonder we see so many people caught up in the anti-vax and anti-mandate campaign while having no interest whatsoever in looking at fundamental issues about why they feel so alienated and so angry, why their children have no future in this country. And it's because of this growing inequality. And public interest before corporate interest was set up for that very reason. we can't be co-opted. We don't accept donations. We can't be co-opted. We have a policy which is based on introducing competition into a capitalist society, but not competition among huge corporations who pretend to compete but collude, but competition based on establishing alternative infrastructure, by establishing a collective and cooperative sector to the economy. Nobody gets rich being in a cooperative or a collective, but what you do is you can actually work in productive labour to produce goods and services which are needed for a fair return. We want to see the reintroduction of the public sector. We want public education subsidised, not have public resources go into the private education sector in order to provide private education for people who've got the resources to pay for their children's education. We want to see more money, especially with COVID-19, going to the public health sector. And just as important, we want to see the growth of quarantine centres. We want to see the growth of a national pandemic centre with branches around the country. We want to see the establishment of emergency centres around the country which can deal with emergencies due to climate change, whether it's storms, whether it's floods, whether it's fires, whether it's another pandemic. But no, we continue on this private investment for private profit. A concept which co-opts everything which is good and decent in this country. It turns it into an equation on how to make money from other people. And you make money from other people by, one, ensuring that you and only you have access to scarce resources, as we see in the mining sector, by passing legislation which restricts the ability of workers to agitate to improve their condition, by opening the borders of this country to temporary workers who are basically here to ensure there is a break on wage increases. And nothing highlights this more than the cry from the hospitality sector and the tourist sector and many other sectors which relied on cheap non-unionised labour in order to make a profit. They're now crying because they can't make a profit because there's no longer that source of cheap non-unionised labour which is frightened to say anything, because if they say anything they're deported because they're on temporary visas. And then we have the situation where public assets have been virtually given away, essential public assets which provide essential services. Things like the NDIS, which is basically a honeypot for the private sector. We've got the privatised aged care sector, the privatised early childhood development sector, and all at the expense of the cooperative, collectivist public sector. So until you put your support behind organisations, not necessarily public interest for corporate interest, but other organisations which are promoting a public first agenda, which are promoting the establishment of collectives and cooperatives to provide competition to the corporate sector, we will continue to be devilled by problems which no society like ours should be devilled with. And even when you look at the pandemic response, how it was all privatised, how we had privatised hotel quarantine which turned out to be a disaster, how we had privatised distribution of vaccines which turned out to be a disaster, and the list goes on and on and on. You look at the private sector, its primary responsibility is to generate profits for each major shareholders. And if you think that's all very well because you've got a superannuation scheme which invests in the private sector, and that's all superannuation schemes do these days. They invest in the private sector. Very few invest, in collectives, cooperatives and public infrastructure. But if you think that's all very well, think of this again. Every cent you have in that superannuation fund could disappear overnight if there's a collapse in the stock market. If the topsy-turvy economic world we live in the house of cards crumbles. Overnight you can lose everything. There is no security in having superannuation. Security comes from having institutions, public institutions, which provide essential services. Security comes from having a strong social security net which guarantees income when you're sick or disabled or old. That's where security comes from. It doesn't come from a privatised superannuation system which only looks after the needs of those who have, been able to make money during their lifetime. Everybody else is pushed aside into an underfunded social security system. So if you're concerned about what's happening in the world today, if you don't want to be co-opted by the private investment for private profit crowd, if you want to create a society based on the satisfaction of need, not infinite desire, if you want change, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. Unfortunately, because of the change in federal legislation, where membership rates have had to increase from 500 to 1,500 to be a registered federal party. We cannot be a registered federal party currently, but we are aiming for that. But we've got a good chance of being a registered Victorian-based party within the next few months if you join. We need another 80 to 90 new members. Go to the website pibci.net, PIBCI.net, download the application form, send it back. You can send it online, you can post it back. If you haven't got access to a printer or you haven't got access to the net, well then we can always send you out some copies of the application form. 0439 395 489. If Clive Palmer can be resurrected because of a potential $100 million investment in the next federal election, we can also become a powerful force in this country through the strength of our ideas, through the strength of our solutions, not through the amount of money that sits in our pockets. Think about it. The end of the year is coming. Do something for yourself. Join public interest before corporate interest today.